So hopefully you have the sources, and I figure I take a recent headline for part of the conversation, and that is just yesterday when I was preparing the sources, came across Israel-U.S. kick off massive war games and apparent message to Iran. Israel Defense Force and the U.S. Central Command on Monday kicked off a large-scale joint exercise in Israel over the northeastern Mediterranean Sea. The two militaries announced the drill, dubbed Juniper Oak 2023. They always have great names. Will involve 140 aircraft, 12 naval vessels, and artillery systems from both nations, and last until Friday, CENTCOM said in a statement. A senior U.S. defense official told NBC News that the drill was aimed at showing adversaries such as Iran that Washington is not too distracted by Russia's invasion of Ukraine and threats from China to mobilize a large military force. Right there, one of the things that has been part of the conversation is to try and contain Iran, to prevent them or stop them, to convince them not to build a nuclear weapon, is that there's a military response. And there'll be a military price to pay if they go forward, that the U.S. and Israel are committed to doing something. And anyone who followed some of the back and forth negotiations and how things were going in, around 2010, 11, 12, it was always Israel getting ready to strike that led the U.S. to push harder on Iran, whether it be the sanctions or whether, when they negotiated the deal, the Iranian deal, the JCPOA it's called, that it was always the threat of nuclear in Israel strike that led to some progress. And it has always been on the Israeli position that if the U.S. presents a credible military option, that will stop Iran from moving forward. So we're trying to show that is this option out there. Nuclear weapons are also in the news with what's going on Ukraine, right? Every couple of days, weeks, there's the rumbling, the saber rattling with regards to what happened there, right? This was from a couple of months ago. Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov warned the West on Monday not to underestimate the elevated risk of nuclear conflict over Ukraine, and said he viewed NATO as being, in essence, engaged in a proxy war with Russia by supplying Kiev with weaponry. Russian Lavrov said it was doing a lot to uphold the principle of striving to prevent nuclear war at all costs. This is our key position, which we base everything. The risks now are considerable. Lavrov said, I would not want to elevate these risks artificially. Many would like that. The danger is serious and real. We must not underestimate it. Okay, this whole idea of the Russia once again part of this mix harkens back to the days of the Soviet Union and the like. So, what are some of the religious sources, Torah sources? We know war is terrible, right? War is hell and war is bad, but war is sometimes essential and sometimes necessary. So just first, a very common source that we're familiar with, that preservation of life is most important. He who destroys a single life is accounted as if he's destroyed the entire world. One who preserves a single life is accounted as if he's preserved the entire world, right? We believe the koach nefesh overrides almost everything, and even in those three cardinal sins which you should not override, right? Very famously, the Rambam points out, right? We know that there's three sins: yehareg, v'al yavor. Right? You should be willing to die rather than transgress, which means preservation of life does not override them. The Rambam says if a person transgressed and was not killed for them, it's not really a full violation. It's done under duress. We know that people want to live and they'll do anything at all costs in order to do so. For the most part, even if you improperly live, right, you transgress and don't die for the sake of the religion when you're supposed to, we still don't really recognize that as a full violation, because we know people's intent is to live. It's interesting. I think we've spoken about this once before. The first in that Gemara where it talks about chayecha kodmin, right? Two people who are in the desert and they only have one bottle of water. We know the conclusion is you drink it and live. Chayecha kodmin. But there's a differing opinion there, right? The Gemara quotes first that they should both share the water and both die. So just kind of an interesting postscript. It's part of the discussion that gets rejected, and that ultimately we know chayecha kodmin, we do whatever we can to survive. But it was not the absolute thrust forward. There was this approach that no, sometimes it's you don't do everything you can to live. Sometimes there's a competing value. In any event, pikuach nefesh. But when it comes to war, there are a couple of things that we need to preface with. First, Judaism recognizes war. The Torah's presentation of war usually involves milchemet mitzvah or milchemet reshut. There's the obligatory wars, and those are the wars fought against enemies named in the Torah. And then there's the optional wars, which are necessary, but are not mitzvahs in and of themselves. They're there for the preservation of life. And war being hell is acknowledged that people are going to die. And the Gemara in Shavuot, source number 4, talks about the idea. Shmuel says a monarchy that kills 1 of every 6 individuals in the world is not punished for doing so, as that is the prerogative of a monarch. As it is stated, my vineyard, which is mine before me, you, Shlomo, shall have 1,000. This is a reference to the monarchy of heaven. And 200 for those who guard its fruit. This is a reference to the monarchy of earth. So out of the 1,200 people mentioned in the 2 parts of the verse, 200 or 1/6 are the prerogative of the earthly monarch, and you can march them off to battle and to possible death if needed. The idea of what's considered an acceptable casualty or risk. So the Gemara recognizes that you can risk up to 1/6 of the population in battle, and that's considered acceptable. Terrible, but acceptable. So we value life. We acknowledge that there is war. We acknowledge that in war there will be casualties, and we even can push the envelope on those casualties from a Talmudic perspective. Up to 1/6 of the population we're willing to sacrifice in battle. Just we wanted to, before we move into the pivot, because one of the things, what about selling weaponry or sharing technology? Questions, comments, or reactions on the preservation of life being balanced by the hell of war, and what might be considered acceptable risk or casualties.
Rabbi?
Yes.
It all comes down to the leader of the country. Once the leader of a country understands that his own life is threatened by an attack, then he holds up and does not, even Putin knows that. And that is what's keeping both those countries from using nuclear weapons.
Oh, so you raise the issue of the mindset of the leader, of the ruler, and I think we're going to talk about that. We're starting off with what are some of the Torah sources that may shape the perception. Obviously, the ruler makes a difference. So, where's the ruler's mindset coming from? As you were mentioning that, it seems to me that there would seem to be a certain advantage to the ruler being someone who has been in battle before, or has led soldiers into battle before, and knows what it's like to risk people's lives or have people who served under them killed, because then you have a fuller appreciation. Right? If all you did is play video games and watch movies, or game theory, it's all fake. It's all theoretical. It's all in the realm of the academic. And even when you go out into practically to be quote unquote commander in chief, you kind of wonder what kind of how can anyone be ready for that? It is interesting to read about the biographies or autobiographies of leaders who were military men. I don't think we've had any heads of state or government who have been military heads who are women yet. But we have, we have soldiers. We have the warrior soldier. I like Eisenhower, led World War II. Throughout that, you think about it. All of the criticism, of when Bill Clinton was running for president because he had shirked the military responsibility or something like that, or George W. Bush. Interesting when they talk about the Israeli government and Israeli leadership. Someone like Benjamin Netanyahu, who served in Sayeret Matkal, served in as a commander of Israel's units and led men on missions and lost men. And they talk about some of the some of the new ministers in this government who had very limited or no military service, right? A number of governments ago, it was Amir Peretz from the Labor government, who was basically the head of the labor union, who became defense minister. And that was, I think, during the Second Lebanon War. It was a disaster. Now, this government, a couple of the ministers had curtailed or limited military service. And clearly, I think in particular, they have the defense ministers, Yoav Gallant from the Likud party, but they have Bezalel Smotrich, who has certain responsibilities in the Yehuda and the Shomron, which is really under the jurisdiction of the military, and he had very limited service because he was rejected from service. So this idea of having a leader who appreciates the gravity and has experience with war is something that we're familiar with. I think the Jewish equivalent would be to fully appreciate trying to appreciate what Judaism expects from the military leader or the ruler when going into battle. Hence even the discussion of the Gemara in Shavuot about you have the ability to sacrifice 1/6 of the population if necessary. That's a number, right? That's it's 200 out of 1,200 or 2,000 out of 12. It's all a number until you're actually in the battle. And so clearly leadership matters, and an appreciation of the gravity and responsibility of leadership is something I think that the Jewish approach, the Talmud, is expecting to fully appreciate it. It's nice sources and comments until it actually goes into battle, but you want someone who has internalized the sentiment or the rationale for this before going to it. And in many ways there is an appreciation of in order to win, there's going to be concessions. People have to die in order for there to be victory, or sometimes even with regards to the morality. And here we come about selling weapons, and this is something that is often discussed as Israel has a very state of Israel today really is what has put some of these religious principles, sources, laws, Torah worldview into practice, because Dwight Eisenhower wasn't looking back to the Talmud or thinking about the Rambam. Neither is necessarily I was going to say Menachem Begin. Menachem Begin might. He had a very Jewish sensibility, even if he wasn't an observant individual. But I don't necessarily think the leaders of Israel are thinking about these sources too much, other than maybe the religious Zionist leaders of Israel, because they see the state of Israel as a manifestation of an opportunity to apply these Torah principles and values and details into real life. But I was going to say we haven't yet had a religious Zionist prime minister. We did, but it was only for a year, and they kept things very much stable, and didn't want to. We didn't get a chance to see that in practice. Although I saw that Naftali Bennett is coming to speak in New York next week, so maybe you could ask him. But there's but for the most part, as Jews, when we look at in some of these sources, what kind of direction, guidance, wisdom do we glean? So. Preservation of life, paramount. War is hell. There's going to be cost and sacrifice. But what about with regards to weapons? So the Rambam, in source number 5, it is forbidden to sell Gentiles any weaponry. We may not sharpen weapons for them or sell them a knife, chains put on the necks of prisoners, fetters, iron chains, raw Indian iron, bears, lions, or any other object that could cause danger to people at large. One may, however, sell them shields, for they serve only the purpose of defense. So here we see that the Jewish role within the broader society is not to do anything that will lead to more proactive aggression, but we're in the defense business. Now, they talk about the defense business these days, they're talking about weapons of offense and defense, but in the military business, where the Jews are prohibited from taking a proactive role on offense because it's really there for defense. We don't want to be contributing to aggression and war in any proactive sense, but only when it comes to protection. Now, if you're starting to think about applying this to contemporary Israeli arms industry, so there's the there's the self-interest exception. Gemara in Avodah Zarah takes this up, source number 6. Rav Ada bar Ava says one may not sell blocks of iron to Gentiles. What is the reason? Is because they forge weapons for them. The Gemara says, if so, then even hoes and axes should not be sold to them, as they too can be used to forge weapons. Rav Zvid said in response, the ruling of Rav Ada bar Ava was stated with regard to Indian iron, which is of superior quality used only for crafting weapons. Right? You can't give things that will be only for weapons. So Gemara clarifies. And as for the fact that nowadays we do sell all weapons, Ramashi said we sell the weapons to the Persians who protect us. So there's this self-interest exception. The Persians protect us, so we'll help them have weapons, even if though those weapons might be used for offense. And the Rambam mentions this Gemara with regard to permitted to sell weapons to soldiers of the country in which one lives because they defend the Jewish inhabitants of the land. There's a certain amount of self-interest. Look, it's preservation of life. This idea of self-interest is found in different areas of the Gemara, often in a related theme with regards to the way the rabbinic leadership has always related to the rulers of the land. There's always a willingness to compromise for self-interest. And that's just the reality sometimes. Sometimes it would be a parallel conversation, but in politics, there's the ideal and there's the necessary and there's the practical. So we don't want to be selling anything that will be used for weapons in a offensive capability. However, to maintain the relations with those nations who have military might and would also protect us, our allies, we have that exception. Rambam source number 8, when the Jews dwell among the idolaters and have established a covenant with them, it is permissible to sell weapons to the servants of the king and to his soldiers, because they use them to wage war against the enemies of the country to protect it. Thus, they also protect us, for we dwell among them. All right, think about in this day and age with all the conversation about the Abraham Accords and the various collaborations between the armies of the Middle East. Right, this connects somewhat geopolitically to Iran because it's really the common enemy which has led the countries in the Middle East to look at Israel more as an ally, even with whatever disagreements remain. It is that let's work with them because they protect us, for we dwell among them. And that's definitely, there's a whole conversation now about certain joint defense efforts. There's a certain joint air command. They're all working with the U.S. Central Command. It's all about, there's a certain amount of self-interest here. Just in terms of how this was applied to the modern state of Israel, Rabbi Chaim David Halevi, chief rabbi of Tel Aviv, there is no doubt that the state of Israel engages in such sales on the basis of security considerations that takes into account the benefit which will arise to us therefrom. And he's applying this whole conversation about you shouldn't sell offensive weapons to the Gentiles versus you're allowed to sell defensive weapons to the Gentiles versus the idea of having security considerations for any of the sales that are being made. That's what it's about. And in many ways, that's the whole idea of the state of Israel applying some of these Torah values and principles in a real world scenario. So those are some of the halachic and textual backgrounds with regards to war, with regards to weapons, and then maybe we'll take it to the discussion of nuclear weapons, which thankfully remain in the theoretical. What is the term? Israel, when it came to nuclear, its possession of nuclear weapons had, what was it? They had a policy of nuclear ambiguity, and they said that we won't be the first to introduce nuclear weapons into the Middle East. So thankfully it's in the theoretical, but let's talk a little bit about how it might be applied practically. Before we do so, questions, comments, reactions to some of these sources or ideas.
Hi, Rabbi. I wonder how modern theories of war, offensive versus defense, the best offense is a good defense or whatever, might change this perspective of Chazal in establishing offensive versus defensive weapons.
Right. So look, let's take a look at some of the comments. You can see when looking at the source of the tradition, right? The Journal of Orthodox Jewish Thought, published by the RCA, 1962, talked about nuclear war. We'll see in a minute. Some from Maurice Lamb, and then commenting on that, Jewish philosopher Michael Wishegrad and Emmanuel Jacobowitz, chief rabbi of England, but that a lot had always been localized. A lot had always been localized. A lot had been just kind of hand-to-hand combat. They're just the brute force of war, right? In terms of you can read the histories or the images. So in my mind, you think of war, 700 years ago. It's like the movie Braveheart. Not that I want to mention I would say Mel Brooks, no, Mel Gibson movie. It's just bloody, brute force. So that's 1,000 years after Chazal. So there's clearly, for the most part, war is just this kind of brutish hand-to-hand combat violence. Certainly modern times led to, more specific examples of conversations. It went from, for example, they talk about bringing your sword into shul, weaponry, or carrying your sword on Shabbos. Is it a weapon? Is it clothing? Right? That's the whole, I guess, you can't have a class about war and stuff these days because, season 4 Fauda's out now. So just, everyone's walking around with a gun in their pants, right? There's different ways of approaching, but I think, certainly modern technology and nuclear in particular, led to, force this evaluation. There's a quote from David Ben-Gurion, 1948, in source 14. We're living in an age of scientific revolutions, an era that discloses the atom, its miraculous composition, the tremendous power hidden in it. Right? Is that something that was envisioned in previous generations? With the push of a button, you can destroy a whole city. So, I think that when they talk about, look at the numbers that the Gemara mentions, 1,200 people, 200 are up for grabs or are dispensable if you go into battle. And now we're talking about much bigger numbers, much bigger impact. And that's how they approached it. So let's take a look at some of the approaches, right? The part of it was this is what society was addressing at that time, right? This was the conversation when they started working on splitting the atom, early on, when the scientists who were working on this had actually, many of them, once they were able to split the atom, there were all these petitions, and a lot of the scientists who worked on it were opposed to actually using it militarily. And whether it be, Einstein very famously signed the petition, so the other scientists working on the Manhattan Project. So, they had unleashed something that they didn't want to see in use. So, as the Cold War deepened, this became really the conversation, and it was known as the red versus dead debate, right? Because what are our options if we don't stop the Soviet Union? Then we may end up red, living under communism. But if we try to stop them militarily, we'll all end up dead, right? This is the mutually assured destruction strategy. And so there were a number of, militarily, they're not going to, talk about the philosophy of it, but people were thinking about it especially, the 50s and 60s. So some felt, no, better to be dead, right? And which meant, because what's the purpose if we end up fighting and there is a nuclear attack and you respond the same way, everyone's gone. So we should be willing to go red. Better to live under communist domination than let the better communist domination than planetary annihilation. And that was one approach that was taken. And then there was another, and one of the proponents of it was a philosopher by the name of Sidney Hook, who felt, no, as I read the history, it's in source number 10 of Western culture, it seems to me that survival at all costs is not among the values of the West. The man who declares that survival at all costs is the end of existence is morally dead because he's prepared to sacrifice all other values which give life its meaning. He argued that some societies it's not worth living in. So if it's a choice between red or dead, I don't want to live in a life that's red. I don't want to live in a world that's red. And so that was look. No one's saying let's go to war, but the idea of I guess playing it out to its conclusion, better to all be dead than be red. So this was something that Maurice Lamb, known for his classic book Jewish Way in Death and Mourning, which I guess became a lot, for some reason, was a lot more popular than his Love and Marriage book. That tells us something about the way we approach reading the books on these subjects. But he wrote in 1962. He wrote a major essay. He wrote the main essay in that volume of Tradition about red versus dead, and he essentially sided with those who felt dead rather than red. Right, source number 11, we would still be committed to defend with our lives the religion and values, the morals and ethics, the very life of our people. Above and beyond all other considerations, the most vital and crucial is his Torah. You may surrender all he has for the sake of peace, but you can't surrender what he is. And if communism takes over, and this is certainly the way it was perceived in the particularly Jewish community with the Iron Curtain and the closing, shutting down of all religious life, being reduced to mere physical existence, being denied the basic moral character of our people and deprived of that faith, which alone has ensured the survival of the Jews, is not living. If martyrdom is ultimately required for this purpose, we must walk in the paths of our fathers who did not shrink from the prospect. We cannot, again, this was not a military strategy, but we cannot just submit and even countenance the possibility of being able to be turned red. You have to fight and have the deterrence and even be willing to sacrifice in order to maintain our way of life. Right? And this, this kind of puts, I would say, was not uncommon in the Orthodox rabbinic thinking of the dangers of communism. Right? You kind of fast forward, you move. Look, this is a theoretical conversation. This is an idea. These are philosophers talking. These are not military generals talking. But when you take it, when you looked at, for example, a few years after this in the Vietnam War, there seeing some of the religious leaders' responses to it, you had those who opposed the war with regards to some with regard to social values and why all this unnecessary death, or the fact that the war was unfair and predominantly difficult for certain segments of society. That was one approach. Those were kind of the anti-war protesters, and then you have some of the more conservative approaches, like Rabbi Joseph who felt the domino theory was real, and that the danger was of communism as almost an existential evil. And again, looking at it through a religious lens as opposed to military lens, but you have to be so afraid of communism that you think it's worse than death to fight it with every breath, or to fight it with a nuclear battle. So that was the idea, and you see it with regards to the language that Lamb uses, being reduced to mere physical existence, or you can surrender all you have, but you can't surrender what he is. You can't surrender Torah It's a religious approach. It's a spiritual approach. It's maybe think of it more as an otherworldly approach. All right, that's that's in that realm of thought. You had others who were willing to look at more the human cost of things. Michael Wishagrad, Jewish philosopher, where war will lead to the certain annihilation of all mankind. It seems much more reasonable to wait and let the choice of martyrdom come up on the individual level, keeping in mind that no matter how efficient a totalitarian system may be, there's always the hope that many individuals will save themselves without transgressing these crucial commandments and thereby ensure the survival of the Jewish people. He's like, you can't, he's like, in theory, correct, but you can't give up that much hope in humanity that we'll ever end up that way. It's kind of, the Lamb approach is just looking at worst case scenarios and elevating that to how you'll make your decision, as opposed to having a little bit more hope that it won't be as bad as all that. And it's kind of, letting a more practical, realistic embrace of this worldly existence, that yes, on the eternal level of things, black and white, I get it, but much more reasonable to wait and let it play out. Right? It brings to mind, they tell the story of the Cossack who captures the Jew, the Lithuanian yeshiva bacher, and says, "Jew, I'm going to kill you." And the Lithuanian yeshiva bacher says, "Just give me a minute to prepare myself to meet my end." And he says, "Hineni muchan u'mezuman l'chaim mitzvahs aseh shel kiddush Hashem." I'm prepared to fulfill the commandment of sanctifying my life, sacrificing my life to sanctify the name. And he says, "A bracha asher kiddushan mitzvah al kiddush Hashem." He's supposed to say bracha before the mitzvah. And the Cossack is watching this Jew muttering and talking and swaying. He says, "You're crazy," and he walks away. So the Jew's life is spared, but the yeshiva bacher said a bracha, so he runs after the Cossack going, "No, no, no. Because I said a bracha, he has to die." So it's kind of, yes, but in real life, you're alive. So Wishagrad is taking a more, this worldly approach. Yes, we aspire to the next world, but let's wait a second before we embrace a whole worldview that just leads to more and more and more possibility of nuclear aggression breaking out. Also, more on the side of arguing with Lamb was Rabbi Emanuel Jacobowitz, right? The chief rabbi who later became the chief rabbi of the British Commonwealth. He was the rabbi at Fifth Avenue Synagogue. So it's one thing to fight, but let's take a look at the source 13. In view of this vital limitation of the law of self-defense, it would appear that a defensive war likely to endanger the survival of the attacking and defending nations alike, if not indeed the entire human race, can never be justified. On the assumption then that the choice posed by a threatened nuclear attack would be either complete mutual destruction or surrender, only the second alternative may be morally vindicated. Also within the realm of ideas, as he says, the morally vindicated, you can't promote an approach that's going to lead to annihilation of both sides or the entire human race. On some level, he's taking some of the statements that we saw about what are acceptable losses or casualties in a war very literally. Look, if you're talking about 1/6 of the Earth's population, I can maybe follow that through to his conclusion. But by what right can we say red versus dead, choose dead if it means everyone's going to die? That's not morally acceptable. Now, so he's taking a little bit further. Wishagrad is saying, in theory, maybe Lamb is right, but let's, why should we assume it has to be a zero-sum game when it comes to Jewish life continuing? And Jacobowitz is saying, look, you can't say that. Judaism, look, morally, spiritually, you can't say that. What the essence would be, just like, when someone doesn't die for the sake of religion as expected, that's another conversation. So, what's interesting is that this, how did this play out in Israel? Right, we know that Israel was concerned, and we saw before Ben-Gurion's looking at science, and he himself said, "I'm confident that science is able to provide us with the weapon that will secure the peace and to our enemies." Right, in the 1960s, Israel was developing its nuclear program. So there is what's called the Samson option, that some military, see source 15, the definition of the Breirat Shimshon, that Israel's deterrent strategy of massive retaliation with nuclear weapons as a last resort against the country whose military has invaded and or destroyed much of Israel. And this is named after Samson, Shimshon, right? Tamos nafshi mos yisharim. Samson was about to die. What does he do? He kills everybody. So this came up in an article called "The Last Nuclear Moment," summarizes this. Right? They say that since the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945, the world has come to nuclear brink only twice. The first and better known was the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962. The second, and much less discussed, occurred in the early days of the Yom Kippur War. Right? He's writing 30 days ago today, back in 2003. So, Cuban Missile Crisis got close. Israel was, according to historians, or at least some historians, it came very, very close to being the next potential nuclear moment on the battlefield. And he talks about, we all know the Yom Kippur War breaks out, and it was Israel was caught flat-footed. And books have been written as to why exactly they were caught flat-footed, and there's a whole host of military analysis as to why they waited. They didn't want to have they didn't want to preempt, because that would get them in trouble. They got lucky. Six-Day War was all about the preemptive strike, but look at all the political fallout, so they decided, let's absorb it. In any event, it started off fairly poorly. At the end of that day, on October 8th, Defense Minister Moshe Dayan was heard murmuring about the end of the Third Kingdom. The commander of the Air Force, General Benny Pellet, warned that with the rate of losses his forces were enduring, within a week, Israel might no longer have any effective air power. It was arguably the darkest day in the history of the Israeli army. It was the early hours of October 9th that senior Israeli military leaders brought up the idea of using Israel's doomsday weapons. By that time, Israel lost some 50 combat planes and more than 500 tanks, 400 in the Egyptian battlefield alone. According to a new book by Ronan Bergman, when the prime minister's top military aide heard those ideas, he begged the army's deputy chief of staff, tears in his eyes, "You must save the people of Israel from these madmen." Right? He couldn't believe that the Israeli leaders were even entertaining the thought of a doomsday weapon. Later that morning, at the end of a somber briefing before the war cabinet, Mr. Dayan raised the nuclear option with the prime minister. No detailed record has surfaced as to what exactly Mr. Dayan proposed, but we know he gave an overall assessment that Israel was fast approaching the point of last resort. And certainly Mr. Dayan wanted the U.S. to take notice that things had reached such a point, that he meant using nuclear weapons, albeit in coded language, as the time no one dared call them by name, was confirmed in an interview by Naftali Lavie. Naftali Lavie is the brother of Rabbi Yisrael Meir Lau. This is Naftali and Yisrael. Naftali and Srulik were the brothers who survived the Holocaust. Naftali is the father. He's passed away, of Rabbi Benny Lau, who was Mr. Dayan's spokesman during the war. This set the stage for a moment that defined Golda Meir's other legacy, her nuclear legacy. Supported by other members of her war cabinet, notably the ministers Israel Galili and Yigal Alon, she refused to concede to Mr. Dayan's gloom and doom rhetoric. Ultimately, Mrs. Meir's nuclear legacy goes far beyond those days in October 1973. Her prudence contributed significantly to the creation of the nuclear taboo. The recognition of nuclear weapons are not like any other weapon humanity ever invented, that under virtually any circumstances, they must never be used. So it's interesting. And again, not all the information is fully confirmed by those there, but there seems to be a fairly broad consensus that the possibility was raised. Weapons of last resort, red or dead. And in that situation, where the world may have gone very close to nuclear war, they backed away from the brink. Now, how close were they to the brink? And in the end, we know Israel had a very successful counterattack and captured a lot of territory at the end of the Yom Kippur War. Much of the viewing of the Yom Kippur War as a defeat comes from the feelings of the early days and some of the intelligence, military leadership failures. In many ways, from a strategy perspective and just a military analysis, it was a success. But and how much of that was based on the fact that it just wasn't as successful as 67? What was Dayan really thinking? How bad did things get? All of that is, armchair quarterbacking and subject to all different viewpoints that have been taken. But there does seem to be a fairly broad consensus that got very close to introducing nuclear weapons, and they didn't. And I'm not necessarily sure that everybody in the Israeli cabinet read Maurice Lamb's article or familiar with Sidney Hook or Bertrand Russell's philosophical dispute of whether to disarm or not. But this would seem to be the mindset. Or this could be there is the religious, halachic, philosophical, theological framework for putting that the question into practice. And in 1973, it seems that we sided certainly we sided with Wishograd, if not Jacobowitz. And again, they were talking theoretically and philosophically, but I think these are some of the variables that go into such a conversation. Ultimately, what I think we would probably all agree to is that we put enough emphasis on peace. We end, Oseh Shalom B'Mromav, Hamavarech Amo Yisrael B'Shalom, V'Yasem L'cha Shalom. Let the topic be mostly theoretical and for conversation, but we live in a dangerous world. And we see that some of our Torah sources and legal sources and philosophical sources, spiritual sources can provide us with a little bit of guidance on this. And at least in the one case, the practical real world example, which may have come up, we chose to move away from the brink.